In this lesson, we're going to continue examining some of the intervallic properties common to all staves. So remember that this group of 5 lines and 4 horizontally running spaces is called the staff, and you remember that the plural of staff is staves. So in the previous lesson, I was specifically looking at the interval properties from one line to another across the entire range of the staff. In this case, let's take a look at the spaces. So I want you to remember that the spaces from bottom to top are numbered as 1, 2, 3, and 4. We got 4 of them. And then you also remember, like in the previous lesson, that I had put X's on the space directly below and directly above the staff. Remember, these are not numbered. They're just awkwardly described as the space directly below the first line and the space directly above the fifth line. Remember that this is line number 1 and this is line number 5. Okay, so we're going to worry about these X's as well. So instead of using these numbers, parenthetical numbers, the X's, I'm going to go back to using those note heads, those circles that represent an individual pitch. So I'm going to start by placing the first circle right here on space number 1. And the next one will be on the adjacent line directly above, right? That's line number 2. And then I'm going to put my next note head on space number 2 as well, right? That's space number 2. So what do you remember about the properties here, the intervallic properties, as we move from a space to an adjacent line, and similarly, from a line to an adjacent space? Well, all of these are steps, which are sizes of 2. So just like we did with the lines, that means that you can conclude that from a space to the next adjacent space is a skip or a size of 3. And just remember that in the previous lesson, we did a lot of work with musical math, right? That is compounded intervals where we subtract out the overlap. So in this case, 2 plus 2, of course, in regular arithmetic equals 4, but we subtract out the overlapping tone, in this case, whatever is on the second line, and we're left with 3, which is the size of a skip. So this is all review. You're pretty comfortable with this. So what this represents is that from a space to the next space will always be a skip. So let's try this out, just like we did with the lines. So from a space, that's the first space, to the second space, that's a skip. What about from the first space to the third space? Well, that's 2 skips, and 2 skips, as you know, equal a fifth. If you need to review why that is, go back to the previous lesson. Again, it just has to do with musical math, adding 3 plus 3, subtracting out the overlap, and we're left with a fifth. Finally, if I go to the last space, or space number 4, that's going to be an interval of a seventh. Okay, so that should sit pretty comfortably with you. Now, let's try a little bit more. What if I go to the space directly below the staff? Remember, that's really awkward, right? It's the first X I had up here. So I'm going to put a note head there, and this is just another skip below space number 1. And so what is the interval from, okay, here we go, here's a mouthful, from the space directly below the staff all the way up to space number 4? Well, we're just adding a skip to the previous seventh, and so 7 plus a skip minus the overlap, and we're left with a ninth. So from, okay, here we go, one more time. So from the space directly below the staff all the way up to space number 4 is an interval of a ninth. Let's do one more. If I add a note head to the space directly above the staff, or directly above line number 5, this, of course, from space number 4 is a skip. And so we have what looks like 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3, or 3 times 5, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, again, arithmetically, we know that this is simply a 15th. but we've got to subtract out over all the overlaps. I know you guys are way ahead of me, but you know what? I just have to do it so that it's clear visually what we're doing. So I'm going to highlight all of the overlapping note heads. So there should be 4 of them, right? You can see 4 highlighted overlaps. So 15 minus 4 equals 7. No, I'm just kidding. You guys just making sure you're listening. It equals 11. So you guys already knew that because you were probably way ahead of me by saying, well, we already have that ninth, right? Which is from the space below the staff up to space number 4. So we're just going to add a skip on top of that. So 9 plus 3 minus the overlap is 11. Or from the previous video, why not just do 9 plus 2 so that we're already incorporating that musical math of the skip minus the overlap. And so that's 11 as well. The point is, no matter how you do it, the intervallic distance, right, the size from the space all the way below the staff, God, this is such a mouthful, to the space all the way above the staff. I should probably change highlighters, right? What do you think about this color? Why don't we go from here all the way to there? Well, that is an 11th. Now that tells us something really interesting actually about the staff. It tells us that the range of the staff from the lowest point, I didn't want that, why is that back here? From the lowest point to the highest point, this range, or size in this case, is a range of 11 letters, right? So this actually brings us to the next interesting topic, which what we can do is when we try to figure out sizes as they exist on the staff, what we can simply do is just count the individual lines and spaces. I'm pretty sure that you guys figured this out, but why don't we try something? I'm going to put a note head randomly somewhere on the staff. How about here? So remember, that's line number 3. And I'm going to put a note head, another one, right there on space number 4. What's the interval from here to there, right? The interval size. Oh, that's easy. I just count, right? So here's line number 3. So I'm going to count this as 1. Then the next space is 2. The next line is 3. And the space right above that is 4. And I land at my terminal point here on the 4th space. And so the interval, here, let me clear this out so it's not confusing. The interval from this first letter to the second letter is an interval size of 4. All right, so you can always do that as well if you need to figure out intervals along the staff. You can also start to see certain patterns visually. That is, how they look as visual patterns on the staff. For example, as we've been doing this, you've already gotten pretty comfortable with, for example, seeing steps, correct? So from a line to an adjacent space, step. From a space to an adjacent line, either above, like that, or from a space to an adjacent line below, these are all steps, correct? Now, you're probably used to that. What else are you used to seeing visually? How about from a line to an adjacent line, either above or below? So either going down or going up. Those are obviously skips because we spent a lot of time figuring that out. Okay, you're pretty comfortable with that. Are you comfortable with compounded skips? That is, do you know what a fifth looks like? Definitely. From a line, we skip one line and we go up to the third line. That's a fifth. The same thing is true of spaces. So if I start here and I skip a space and go to the third space, that is also a fifth. You're probably pretty comfortable with seeing fifths. What about sevenths? What about ninths? What about 11ths? All the same. You're probably very comfortable by this point, and if not, as soon as I draw them, you'll say, definitely, that looks like, here, for example, if I draw this and this, so a note head on line number 1 and a note head on line number 4. What is that? What's the interval size? Well, it's a 7th, right? What if I draw a note head on a space and I go all the way up to here? Now, by the way, for the purposes of this lesson, it doesn't matter if the note heads are vertically aligned or if they seem to be read left to right, like this one, left to right. Okay, so it doesn't really matter because I'm displaying an interval that's either being played, as it were, simultaneously. That's this example, if they're vertically aligned, or one after the other, which is left to right. And in music, we'll get to this in another lesson. If you are playing notes simultaneously, that is called a harmonic interval, right? Harmony just means uh, notes played simultaneously or at the same time. And if they look like they're played one after the other, that is called a melodic interval because melody is notes performed or played or articulated in succession, one after the other. All right, I digress. Let's go back to figuring out what it was we were trying to figure out. What were we trying to figure out? This one right there, right? So that is the first space all the way up to, okay, here we go, awkward time to the space directly above the staff. So what is this interval size? Well, let's see. Do you recognize that this is a ninth? Now, am I correct about that? We can do it pretty easily, right? We can just skip up. So from the first space to the second is a third, right? A skip. To the next one is another third. So from our reference point, our uh, note head on the first space, that's a fifth. And then we go up another third to the fourth space, that's a seventh from the bottom. And then again to the first space above the staff, that's a seventh plus another skip, which is a ninth. Okay, so the point of all this, in case you've been losing track with a couple of my digressions, is you can start to see visual patterns. But notice that so far, all the patterns I've asked you to see, with the exception of steps, have all been compounded skips. That is, multiples of skips, right? Thirds, fifths, sevenths, ninths, and of course, elevenths, which represent the range from the space below all the way to the space above the staff. Now, what about other variants? So first, an interesting observation. Have you noticed that all of the compounded skips, like thirds, fifths, sevenths, ninths, elevenths, we can keep going, 13ths, 15ths, etc. Have you noticed that they're all odd numbers? Would you be able to visually identify whether an interval size is odd or even? Well, let's start with the odd part. So a note head on line number 1, a note head on line number 5. I don't care if you can identify the size of this. Tell me first, is this an odd number or an even number in terms of size? The answer is it has to be an odd number because both of these note heads, okay, let me go back to yellow, both of these note heads are on the same part of the staff, meaning they're both on lines. Do you think the same thing would be true if I placed a note head on a space and then went up to some other space? So this is an odd interval size, and you know what? So is this. How do I know? Because this looks like a series of compounded skips, right? Because if I put filled in note heads, sorry, why did I put a note head there? There's no need for that. If I put a series of note heads on the spaces in between, that's a skip, that's a skip, that's a skip. And we know that, of course, 3 plus 3 plus 3 arithmetically is a 9, but you subtract out the two overlaps. So this is a seventh. Well, that's also an odd numbered uh, leap, right? So here's the property. If you put a note head on a line and then another note head on any other line, the resulting interval size will be odd because these are compounded skips. You do the same thing with spaces, right? A space to a space, you will also yield an odd numbered interval size. That's an interesting property because the opposite of that is what if we have one line, let me clear some space here. Kind of funny that I'm clearing space on essentially a platform that has unlimited space. Well, I guess I'm just used to regular teaching on a blackboard where there always is a finite amount of room. but old habits die hard. So here we go. If I start with a node head on a space and I go to a line, well, you know that that is a step, which is a size of 2, which is an even number. Let's extrapolate. What if I start on a space and go up to any other line? Will that be an even or an odd interval size? It's got to be even. Got to be even, because this looks like a series of compounded skips plus a step, right? So here, for example, let me make that visually obvious. I'm going to start on this first space. I'm going to go up to the fourth space. Now that's not this problem, right? But bear with me here. So I'm going to put in the little node heads on the intermediate spaces, and we know that this is 3, right there. That's another third. That's another third. So this, as we've already figured out several times, so I don't really have to belabor this, that's a seventh, right? Well, our original problem is from the first space all the way up to the fifth line. Let me just make sure I highlight that so that it's clear. So what is the interval from, again, the first space to the fifth line? Well, that would be, notice that from this fourth space to the fifth line, that is, of course, a step. Why is it a step? From a space to an adjacent line is always a step. So that's a size of 2. So I have to add 7 plus 2, which, don't jump ahead and say, well, that's 9, so you're obviously wrong. How can that be even? Remember, we've got to subtract out the overlap, right? And so it's 9 minus 1, and that yields 8, which is an even number. Now, by the way, do you remember what 8 is when it's called by a different name? An interval size of 8 is called, okay, I'm holding my breath. I don't know why, because you're not talking to me in real time. So how do I know what you're saying? But it's an octave, right? An interval size of 8 is an octave. So guess what? We have just discovered a shortcut to notating octaves on the staff, which is anywhere you start, you go 1, 2, 3 skips and a step. That's pretty cool, right? Well, it's cool to me. I don't know. Maybe you guys don't agree, but here we go. I'm starting on line number 2. I would like to notate an octave above. Just for review, remember that means to the right on the keyboard. That means up the alphabet. So how do I do it? 3 skips and a step. Let's see if I can do that. So let's see, 3 skips. So skip number 1, right line to a line. Skip number 2, skip number 3, and then a step. Well, a step above the fifth line is going to be, oh, that awkward name, the first space above the staff. There it is. I promise you that this is an octave. Now, if you don't believe me, I mean, I really have no idea why you wouldn't, because, these are just facts here of the staff. But if you are having trouble with this, you can always resort to counting the individual lines and spaces in order from the starting point to the ending point. So you know what? Let's just do that. Let me clear this out, and we're going to go like this. This second line, we're going to count as our first unison, right? We're starting with 1. We go 1, then the space above it is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the space above the staff, 8. So do you see how we got the same result? I mean, obviously this is just longer to count each individual line and space, but you're going to yield the same result, which is 3 skips and a step equals an octave, which is an even number, which tells you, and before we conclude this lesson, it tells you that if you have node heads on different parts of the staff, different components of the staff, that is on a line and on a space, your resulting interval size will be even. Like this. If you have 2 node heads on the same part of the staff, a line to another line, or a space to another space, then the resulting interval size will be odd, as we've indicated, for example, here. Okay? So remember this basic property of staves, and it'll be a lot easier for you to ultimately, like, where's this all going? be able to read music more fluidly, and of course, intervals with greater ease, or interval sizes with greater ease.